this now. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the September 2024 Jobs Report and Inflation Update. My name is Albert, founder of Albert's List, and you are here at the right place if you're looking for news, views, and opinions and insights on figuring out the state of the economy and where things may go for your job search. With me, as always, is my co-host Colin, as well as Dr. Riley White, Associate Dean of Teaching and Learning and Associate Professor of Finance with tenure at the University of New Mexico. The with tenure part is especially important. He joins us monthly to help us break down the state of the job market, understand the state of the economy, and see how they impact you in your job search. You as the viewers are always welcome here to ask your own questions, be a part of the peanut gallery, and throw in your opinions, and so much more. So join us, sit back and relax, pop open a drink. I know it's only Wednesday, it's not Friday, and enjoy. And today, hopefully we also get another treat, which is Dr. White and his 2024 election prediction. Ooh.
Oh, man, this is great. It is such an honor, Albert, to be here. And Colin, thank you so much for having me.
Man, so without further ado, Dr. White, yeah. I'm going to give it to you, and I am looking forward to what you have to say today.
I'm doing this. Green tea all the time is what I'm about, as we figured out before, my unpaid sponsor. Thank you, Aaron, for pointing that out. I appreciate it. This is great. It is good to see you guys. Thank you guys for being here. And thank you for sharing your experience around the job market right now. I know it is a tough situation, and I know, but your experience may vary. And we'll talk today about some of the reasons why that is. We got a slew of questions I was asked in the beforehand that I will try to address. I want to encourage you all to reach out for any questions that you have right here in the chat window. And I'm happy to entertain any such questions that are within the realms of economics, finance, or some other thing like that. We are going to talk about all the things. Let me bring up my new question list here, which is what we're gonna want to make sure I got everything covered and in front of me at the same time. And I think we got it. So what we have right now, let me share my screen. As you can see, we're going to go back in time. Well, we're going to go slightly into the future. Because this is Albert's List and we're about these things. And this is the vision of San Francisco in 10 more years when Albert's List has taken over, mainly due to the fact that commercial real estate has continued to drop to a level where Albert's List can afford to purchase all of the buildings downtown. So it's a very nice and magnificent future that we have. So we're doing a monthly jobs report today. We're going to cover a bunch of things. And the first one I want to cover, I know, dystopia is what we're about here, Albert. This is great. This is Albert's List. It's about finding a job. We're in people. This is Blade Runner. Everybody's a replicant. What's going to happen next? Starfleet headquarters. Marsha, that's right. That's right. It did. It did. It was cheap. Commercial real estate affects even Starfleet. You know, we all are bound by those same economic concerns. So what we have here, I was trying to think of analogs to Jamboree, Albert, so I appreciate that. So September 2024, oh my gosh, we've been going downhill, but not so steadily. And for a while, I want to shout out because Aaron sent me a version of this particular chart via email today. Aaron's very good at slipping in those 5 a.m., 4 a.m. emails with a bunch of solid charts. Thank you, Aaron, for rocking and rolling. I appreciate that. September 2024 was a good jobs month, relatively speaking, and I'll explain why. It beat expectations, and that's sort of an interesting thing. When things are good, they beat expectations. It's like being in the online dating market. It's like being in a real estate market where things are surprisingly cheap. It's like a surprise sale on affordable green tea. It is also something that positively, yes, so that's a really good question, Kyla. I hear you on that. We do it this way because my screen is so wide, it messes it up when I do it. But what I can do, and I hear you on that, is what I'm going to do is I'll reduce my display settings, which is my workaround on this, which I did for another talk I just gave. And if I do that and I bring it down to like, okay, let me see this. So let's see this. Let me know if this works. The downside is it kind of cripples me from doing like the multi-monitor stuff, which I like to do, but it might also limit my ability to rock and roll with some of these questions. Okay, how's that work? Can you see it? This is good. So this is good. How about this one? Does this look better? Do you appreciate? Is that a better feel? Kind of different feel? All right. Thanks, Kyle. I appreciate that. Good questions as always. I'm trying to move my chat window around. The hard part is when I shrink my screen, I have to like hide my chat window in an area where it doesn't obscure what I'm actually trying to talk about. So we had 254,000 jobs last month. That's actually a pretty good number. To get a sense about this, this is the highest number we've seen in a few months. It was greater than we expected, but it doesn't necessarily mean a lot of the things that we saw. When there's a bad market, when there's a bad month, we hear about it in the media. Things are bad. Things are on fire. The job market is ruined. We're not going to get jobs. And when it's good, it's like, oh, things are better now because the Fed cut rates. Now, steering the economy is like steering a battleship. The Fed cutting rates didn't do a lot to affect the job market this month, but there's a lot of reasons and a lot of things in here that led to kind of where we are right now. And as you can see in this employment change by industry, just between August and September, we're adding jobs primarily in just a couple sectors: leisure and hospitality, service sector stuff, working for hotels, working for restaurants, still on the COVID upward rebound. And then also in the higher income level of this, the healthcare and social assistance area. Healthcare, incidentally, we've now added 1.8 million jobs since February 2020, which is amazing. It's the most of any sector, net of where we were pre-COVID. And healthcare, of course, following demographics. People are getting older, things are happening, and people need medical care. And we haven't really solved the healthcare issue. It's about 7% of our GDP is spent on healthcare issues, and it's getting worse because, you know, we haven't really solved the affordability question of healthcare in this country. And there's a lot of outstanding issues involving physician supply, malpractice, a multi-tiered area that has to be addressed to really handle this issue, in addition to questions like coverage. So healthcare is expected to grow, and I expect that this sector will be particularly robust as we go into the future. Government construction, that's okay. Construction jobs coming up in a fall season is actually pretty good. It means they're still building stuff somewhere. So that's pretty good. Oh, this is good too. So Tom, thank you, Aaron. Art says, yes, Art says, I'm used to getting 20 unsolicited calls per day from people asking if I'm available for a job, and now apply for 1,000 jobs and barely get one call back. That's okay. So even though you heard all this media news about the jobs market being strong, your experience is actually justified, because any other sector, from educational services on down to transportation and warehousing, has been flat this last month. We've been adding jobs, but in very few areas. And I want to note that that is important, which is why, unless you're in one of these top 3 areas, you're not seeing a lot of jobs coming through the door. And if anything, we're seeing a lot of people staying put. Aaron says, I'm on the West Coast for 2 more weeks. It gets up at 5 a.m., nap for an hour. I love it. That's rock and roll. You got to do this. Otani jobs. Albert's good. They're talking about Aaron being on the West Coast. That's great. Art would rather see private expenditures rather than government spending. Strong argument for that as well, not least for questions around efficiency, but that's a whole other thing we can talk about. Aaron says, Aaron's dropping hosts and panelists. Thanks, Aaron, for the information. That's cool. We got some stuff here. Leisure and hospitality and healthcare are great. Sector laggards are across the last month, the first time the majority of our sectors in the economy lost jobs. Now they're basically flat. Like, this is within the margin of error of adding or subtracting. Labor force participation is steady. We don't expect this to go up or down a lot more. A lot of that's controlled demographically. Upward revisions for July and August did occur, however. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics, when it goes through a lot of this, they have these monthly revisions and then really big annual revisions like the one they had back at the end of the fiscal year. And the good news is the revisions that we've seen are upward instead of downward, which is nice. They're saying that, hey, we're doing a little bit better than we thought we were. But collectively, the additional 72,000 jobs doesn't move the needle excessively. And that's a really, really interesting. So this is really, really a fascinating space to be in. Health distribution. Most sectors have improved since 2020. And indeed, healthcare and social assistance adding almost 1.9 million jobs. Professional and business services adding 1.6 million jobs. Anchor, that's a really good question. He's asking, did the revisions that were said to be downward, did that change? So revisions occur after every was downward 800,000 jobs for the entire year. And indeed, in the previous month, there were additional revisions that went downward. Because the employer data that we have comes from surveys, a lot of these surveys then have to be verified or also adjusted in response to secondary economic information or tertiary economic information that may pass through this. And so we end up in a situation now where we have a jobs report that was issued one month, and then the following month it gets upwardly revised, and then the following month it's downwardly revised. And so it can happen both ways. And so Anchor, the last revisions were negative. They were down. You're absolutely right. And what's interesting about this month is the last 2 months, meaning before September, so July, August, they were revised upward as well. So that's actually really good that we saw that. But that's based on the information that we had in a more robust consumer spending environment than we thought we had, the previous month. So great question. So since the pre-COVID times, the before times, back when we were youthful and young and carefree in February 2020, manufacturing, information, educational services, utilities, other services, mining and logging, these sectors have not added a lot of jobs in the last 4.5 years. In particular, information as a whole has only added around 89,000 jobs, whereas other services and mining and logging in particular, I know a lot of you all are mining and logging. So if you're here month after month in this, I know you're disenfranchised or unemployed lumberjacks, and I appreciate that. There is a sizable amount of you in Albert's List, and I respect the hard work that you do. It is very hard to live in Oakland and be a lumberjack in 2024, but you're doing it. And I want you to stick to that. You have that degree from Cal State East Bay in lumberjackology. And it's excellent, and it pays well. Aaron says CapEx is 3 times more expensive. Operation X is all services. You're right about that too. Construction, government, financial activities, wholesale trade, all have shown pretty robust turnaround in the last 4.5 years. But your mileage will vary depending on the job that you're in the sector that you're in. And I'm going to reiterate this a few times throughout this adventure. So we've had a lot of talk lately about landings, soft landings, no landings, hard landings. What's the most likely outcome for the global economy in the next 12 months? And so we poll economists, which is another way of asking a group of people who, just like me, are hedging all the time and can't give you a firm answer about anything. Do you want to do this thing? I don't know. 50% chance says I do. We have a history of time going back to May 2023 when we thought as a whole that there was likely starting to be a higher chance of a hard landing. That's dropped off a bit. Our odds of a soft landing basically took control. And even for a brief optimistic period back in spring, there were people who were like, no landing. It's going to go up forever. Sunshine, rainbows, unicorns until the end of time. And a lot of people are still like that. Now, then we had some doldrums in summer. And right now, the good news is we're back to kind of where we thought we would be, which is most of the time, this is the soft landing that we're experiencing. Most economists think it's going to be this way. It's a nice way of saying they don't see a recession in any time, in any way coming up soon. But what does that mean in particular for the sector that a lot of you all are in, especially if you live in the Bay Area or around the Bay Area, in information? And in particular, or tech or other places like this. We know that lower rates help stimulate economic growth, and that takes years to often take place. It makes loans cheaper, financing cheaper, capital cheaper. Right now, the ecosystem for information tech is still the deepest in the Bay Area. That is true. You still have the greatest number of originations and firms. You still attract global talent to this area. But a lot of people are asking and saying, hey, when is it going to turn around? When it's going to happen? Now, it's more responsive because of its volatility historically to economic changes than a lot of other sectors. This is not steel mills. You chose a sector of work that's very dynamic. When the economy starts creaking upward, when there is an optimistic supply or a technology, you see a lot of investment in this area, like you saw even with AI recently. And even though that pans out in different ways, in some ways, too much, you're going to look at this in a sense and be like, well, when there is a recession, tech gets hit but they're often the earlier sectors that start coming out of it because they respond very heavily to economic stimuli. So once we start getting better, and I mean this in a couple ways, when I say better, I want to see an improvement in credit quality across people. I want people to become optimistic about building again. I want the Fed to continue to lower rates in a reasonable but expected way, although there might be some hesitation there because inflation is more or less under control. A couple of questions in here. Art says, seems like so many jobs which US used to be on the West Coast have gone to the East Coast. That's interesting. That's true. You do see some external stuff. And I think what you're observing too is there's a flight into places like Boston in tech and Austin like tech and other things. Both of those cities offer, well, Austin offers a better cost of living. Boston is still pretty expensive. But there's a few intermediary places that a lot of companies try in. But when you look for things and you're looking to, say, generate capital or look for sources and things, the entrenched ecosystem in San Francisco and the Bay Area and San Jose is still so much stronger than it is in other places in the United States. That said, you're going to see departures, and a lot of that could be due to state policies in California, economic policies, just a lack of really affordable living for new firms in other places that makes it very hard to live there. And there are caps on the dynamism of the Bay Area that are kept on the Bay Area that are driven by a lot of these realistic constraints. So yes, you have a deep ecosystem, but where are my people going to live if I have a new startup? And yes, you have this and transportation hubs and access across the Pacific. But what if, I'm really looking for this version, this metrics of success. And it is true that unless the Bay Area gets their act together in one way or another to sort of make it a friendlier place to live, you're going to see some continued flight probably. But there are I've been optimistic at some of the actions that have been taken lately in this. Stanford is not quite moving to Utah yet, although who knows, they might. It's a unique and special place. OY says, what's the source of employment growth by occupation chart? What's the source of the employment growth by occupation? This one? So this comes from the Economic Policy Institute, but the data is the same data that I track. They just do it prettier than I do. This is the Bureau of Labor Statistics data, which collectively tracks employment changes by sector over the last, every month they produce a whole bunch of data. So BLS.gov is a great website for looking at a bunch of all of this data in various capacities of this data. But we have a current event to talk about. So somebody asked me, I had a question about, hey, what do you think about the Nobel Prizes? And what do you think about this? And Colin's got a good question though, and I want to address this first. Shouldn't businesses dislike high housing and shelter costs? Yes, that is my point. Directly drive up wage requirements or drive up expenses, and why aren't businesses lobbying for more affordable housing and fighting landlords about this? What a great question, Colin. That is such an obvious answer. I'm going to fight this over and over again, how much we need to build more in areas where people want to live, like the Bay Area. You can be flying economically if you just built more things. And unfortunately, you don't. And there's a lot of reasons for that, because the owners of these businesses also own those really nice homes in Atherton or Palo Alto or other places where they're rocking and rolling and sitting, man, I got this 2-acre property in an area that should be zoned for 40-story buildings. And I'm sitting on this thing. It costs $12 million and I own this thing. And I don't want any buildings to look like that to be around me. And as a consequence, nothing gets done. So the people who own these companies are simultaneously not driving policy in this direction because it's unpopular. It's an unpopular opinion. And this is my most unpopular opinion, actually. I think we should build where the demand is and make it easy to build in these areas so people can buy equity and people can live there, and families across all incomes can live in cities and other places. Other countries do this outside of the Anglosphere in particular. It's not rocket science. We have that ability. We just don't do it. So it's a thing. We're just very protected. We put up the fences about 100 years ago, invented zoning, called it a day. And the business owners who manage the businesses are like, no, I'm good. I got my house here. Oh, I don't know why real estate's so expensive. I guess I will support a levy to build 10 affordable homes in one part of town instead of the thousands of affordable homes that are necessary to create a more equitable real estate market. But hey, everybody's got an opinion. So yeah, I blame the NIMBYs on that one. Not a NIMBY, I'm a YIMBY. Yes, in my backyard. My backyard, you want to put up a 10-story building? I'm gonna help you. I'll dig it for you for free. I'm just saying, it's gonna rock and roll it. I'm just saying federal minimum wage makes sense when rent is $600, not $3,200. Bam. Also true. Yochin, voters, thank you for calling out the NIMBYs. Yes, because their greed and selfishness is a core issue for the Bay Area these days. Yes, I'm glad to hear. Thank you, Yochin. I appreciate that, and I appreciate that you're looking at it that way, because that's the way that I am. I feel very strongly about that. But it's like the economics are solid on this too. Supply and demand is not extraordinary, and people will, it's very strange. I worked with a colleague who I appreciate very dearly, and he wrote his dissertation on John Milton and Paradise Lost, and he goes through this whole thing about how John Milton went around talking about like the nature of God or something. He went all the way around this thing without actually mentioning it. And that's what it feels like when you talk to somebody about housing policy, is the answer is build more things, but people will go all around it. They'll have every other possible reason. Oh, what if I increase property taxes? Or what if I do this? Or what if I do this? And indeed, some of these suggestions, like building affordable housing, are not bad. But we just need a magnitude that's like 5 levels higher than that is, or else we're just like easing our conscience instead of actually making change happen. And that's a big difference here. And I think that there's a discrepancy between those two things. Probably alienated all our NIMBYs. So those of you who knocked it off, if you're a NIMBY, I apologize. Well, I don't apologize, but I probably offended you greatly, and I acknowledge your pain. But change it. Build something in your backyard. Art says, why are wages going down when prices are going up? No, exactly. Exactly right. Wealth gap is interesting. Kyler's right. Over the last, interesting you ask about wealth gap. Basically since the post-war, we've had an increased level of inequality in the country, with the exception of the last couple years, the couple years in COVID, where we had an injection of $5 trillion of stimulus spending. A lot of that due to labor shortages in the lowest tier service sector type jobs, which pay really little, forced the labor shortages in these areas, forced companies to raise wages in these areas. And that brought about an increase in wages for the lowest tier of our income. That reduced income inequality for the first time that we've seen since 70 years. But income is not wealth. Income is what you earn. Wealth is what you got in the bank and what you have in assets, net liabilities, and other things. And wealth inequality, to Kyla's point, is really, really high. The wealth gap is tremendously high. It's ridiculously high, and it's a big thing. I gave a talk for our state treasurer, who's a friend, and on Thursday, and we were looking at, and I gave a pitch about the economics of baby bonds, which we're proposing, which is the idea that, all New Mexicans, and I live in New Mexico, for University of New Mexico, they'll be given a bond at birth, a form of savings account, which then, when they turn 18, they can spend on what they want, a college education, or a new business, or a car, or who knows what, whatever they want to do. And the idea being is that this, in turn, there's some research that shows that could be an effective way at reducing some of these wealth concerns that people have, wealth gap issues. And so I'm all about policies that actually do things that work. Art says, how about we eliminate taxes? How about more like, that's interesting. So if we eliminated taxes, the question is, where do we derive our revenues for society from? I'm interested in your proposals for that. I'm not discounting that. Colin says, oh yeah, Art, I'm curious how you imagine public utilities. Yeah, take it away. User fees. Oh yeah, that'll be fun. It's a whole other debate. Anyway, nobility. So we got Asimoglu, Simon Johnson, Robinson all win this prize. And they're outstanding researchers, and people said, what do you think about this? What do you think about these winners? I know it was kind of a thing where people were like, well, do they say what they did, or do they do these things? So let me argue first. Oh, these three guys are great economists. They're excellent economists. They're widely cited. Darren, in particular, is like a meme in himself, because he's got like every paper that comes out is like him as a co-author. He is like the literally third highest cited economist of all time. So I'm not really worried. So he's pretty good. Simon Johnson and James Robinson, they're up there too. I feel one's like the 45th best economist, and one's the 135th most cited economist. And what their research looked at was European colonization and how it affected colonized countries. So basically the idea, they were looking at why poor countries were poor and why rich countries were rich. And the idea is that where European settlers faced harsh conditions, extractive institutions were established, while more inclusive institutions were built in wealthier regions with more favorable climates. And countries that were wealthier at the time of colonization now have thriving economies like the US and Australia, while regions with extractive institutions such as sub-Saharan Africa remained among the poorest. And they highlighted that economic growth isn't always beneficial, especially if it's exploitative. And inclusive institutions are crucial for long-term success. And this is interesting because their biggest critique of this research in particular has been the increase in the success of China. I'm keeping an eye on the tax debate in the in the chat window. Keep going, go to town. Oh yeah, rock and roll. Albert is good. This is good. This is an interesting question. I can relate. Decide what you want to do, but I'm going to continue because I know we got a lot of stuff to cover. So researchers highlight economic growth isn't always beneficial, especially if it's exploitative. A lot of this is viewed often through the lens of wherever you stand politically, and there's nothing wrong with wherever you stand politically, of course, in certain respects, just as long as we have a respectful and open debate here on the magic of the internet. But I think for this respect, so a lot of the lens at which the research is viewed through that. The other sign that a lot of people point to and say, hey, what about China? What about China? You know, it was pointed out that some of the research also focused on questions around freedom in particular as being kind of a necessary instrument for a successful development of an economy. But at the same time, they said, well, what about China and China's increase in development and all those other things? And it is not always. The thing about research is, and many times, you know, even good research and well-done research can be overturned or added to or edited or in some way changed in the future. And everybody who does research has that expectation, including myself. And so it's not that they're particularly this way or that. It has caused, I think, because of the nature of the political sphere in this day and age, the sense of the Nobel Prizes themselves seemed, especially if you view it through a political lens, as perhaps a one-sided approach to a vastly complex series of literature and questions that and critics say that, you know, that they're uncertain that the researchers actually prove what they say they did. But I would counter that, and because they're so well regarded, I would say that regardless of whether they proved or didn't prove, they're well cited, and their research has gone on to influence, by consequence, the nature of research that we're doing right now and across the board, across the globe. And so it's a mixed thing. What does it mean to be a Nobel Prize winner? Is it worth it or not worth it? And it's really interesting. So it's a complex question and something worth engaging further about. Oh yeah, so let's talk a little bit. Let's get down here for a second. One thing that, you know, I'm particularly let me move the chat. Wow, all these fun things. Let me catch up for a second on the chat window. We got some, oh yeah, externality. That happens when they realize it didn't work as intended. This is really interesting. This is ultimate. This is a question, right? And so I think one of the most interesting to temper or kind of temper this conversation going on about taxes in particular in the chat window. One of the things that people pretend doesn't exist that we need to really understand exists are trade-offs. And trade-offs are real. Those are real things. We minimize them often. We try to make everybody happy in a room. We, you know, especially I think a lot of well-thinking state policy or well-intended state or federal policy tries to intend to get everybody in the room before a decision is made. And what happens is you delay a project by 10 years or something happens or whatever. All this stuff is down there, but there are trade-offs always. And you have to understand, I guess, and focus on the trade-offs you have, and your opinion on taxes likely depend on your opinion about those trade-offs. So you view it, if you're an economic maximizer, you say, well, I don't need taxes, I shouldn't have them. We should focus on economic maximization. And if you're a proponent of no taxes, you can point to a few very interesting things. You can say, well, you know, we can pay for it by consumption taxes, or we can pay for it by user fees in here and other things. And you can also pay for it in other ways, or pay for society's increases. And there's a debate about what things people pay for, of course, within society. And then if you're for taxes, you view taxes as something that is a necessity, at least in the modern society, to maintain certain living standards and smooth out sort of the harsh realities of life. And so between those two things, you've got a wealth of a spectrum of ideas that exist into what taxes should be. And, you know, the Laffer curve mentioned here, Arthur Laffer was very famous around 40 years ago, drew a curve that basically showed, you know, that theoretically anyway, tried to demonstrate that when taxes are too high, you know, people start shirking them. They leave the country. They do other things to avoid paying taxes. And then when taxes are too low, you know, or actually, when taxes are too high, less revenue will end up coming in than when taxes are a little lower. And that was kind of Laffer's big point into things. And it's a debate as to where people fit on the Laffer curve. Regardless of where you feel in tax policy, I think one thing that people who are, so I am, you know, I am a realist in my political sphere, and my policy sphere is based upon what's achievable within certain timeframes. So simplification of tax code is a good idea. Now, whether tax go up or down is a good question. I think it's a much more important thing that we figure out a way to manage our finances at the government level more efficiently and more effectively. And I know that that is, I think, more important than what the tax rate is what we do with that money and how we spend that money, and then how we manage that money. And there is bloat that happens in any regime which lacks, you know, that sort of a market clearing mechanism in it. Some of that bloat is necessary and a trade-off to obtain a certain level of living standards. Some of that bloat needs to be addressed seriously. And so that's a question that we have to answer. And so people who are hesitant, or I understand those people who are saying, oh, let's get rid of taxes, because when they look at questions, they see the inefficiencies in the government. And meanwhile, people who are like, we need more taxes, are saying, hey, we are not doing this for these people that we owe this to as a society. And so there it is, tax policy. There is an insane amount of ways. I have a story actually about somebody told me they work in a large government institution, and I know this because, you know, in New Mexico, we are the largest employer is the government. And the fiscal year was coming up. The end of the fiscal year was coming up. And they're based because they work on one of the projects through one of the major departments that are designated by the government. And I'm leaving a lot of things out, so I'm trying to be as diplomatic as possible. But they were instructed by their boss and said, you know, hey, you know, we're coming in under budget for this technical project this year. So what do we do? And the boss was like, well, you know, if we can't show up with we can't show up at the end of the fiscal year having less money or using less money than we said we needed, because it looks bad, we won't get that money next year, and we'll have to, you know, do adjustments and lay off people or whatever. And so you got to spend that money now. And they went out and they bought 10,000 desk chairs. Like 10,000 desk chairs that nobody needed because they had to spend this massive amount of money. That was taxpayer money at the end of the year. So it was kind of outrageous that happened. And this is not a common, I don't know, maybe it's a common thing, but this sort of tendency to raise, spend, pork, has detrimental effects on the economy too. And so we have to be thoughtful about this. So yes, we can support taxes, but also we have to be careful about the nature of those tax balances of how they're spent. This is good. So let me go back here a second. Albert, so blah, blah, blah. So would data analysts fall under the green? Really good question. Data processing, yes. Data analysts would be green under this. Kyla. Albert says that Dr. White, to think about the O'Sullivan rule, which states that a government unfounded on more conservative principles tend to veer left over time. Applied in taxes, it means that an unchecked society that does not question what we are spending becomes one of the largest, and that has terrible downstream consequences. That's possible. Human history in general, the hard part is taxes are tricky because we know that well, that regime change and how those things happen can be very gradual, and then there's an overturning of things. But ultimately, you have every incentive when you're within the system to maintain the system. So it's very tricky. And I'm not a revolutionary by any sense, but we do need to have a serious discussion about how finances are used. And I'm not a conservative. I'm not somebody who is arguing in tax policy in a way that would be detrimental. But I think we can't ignore it. I don't think that's something that we can do. Yes, exactly right. Yes, if you're wealthy, you can easily afford to pay for your care without insurance. This is from Mr. Wolters. But if you're poor and you can't afford to pay for healthcare directly, sharing the overall burden. Yes, sharing the overall burden across. I'm sorry, I just lost it because there's all these things popping up again. On a health spectrum, then those poor folks might benefit from health insurance. I for one, am very strong supporter of universal health care. I'll tell that too. Converse, but we have to do it again efficiently, and we have to do that in ways that we manage taxpayer money expediently. Or else people point to waste and they say, that's why I'm not going to pay taxes. And the Laffer curve moves, whether we want to or not, especially when we need revenues. Yeah. Oh yeah, no, I agree. I agree with you, Jochen. That's true. Anyway, California tech sector job growth. So California tech jobs have indeed stagnated, and this is what you're feeling. With search, streaming, and computer system design dropping, this is from Joe Politano, who has a series of these charts that are very, very interesting. So the change in employment since January 2020. Software publishers, not so much. Positive, but not so much. Computing infrastructure, data processing, web hosting, we've seen growth in. Now, on the other hand, we've lost jobs in purple, computer systems design, web search portals, libraries and related, all stuff that's gone downhill. And it's interesting to see, and this is California, some of that stuff is state policy, some of that stuff is industry cycle. Tammy, you have a couple good questions here that I'm sorry, we're buried under a bunch of things. So let me get back to you. Tammy asked the good questions, and I want to keep you engaged, Tammy. So thank you for this. I apologize. So Tammy asked me first, and you asked me this right about 12 minutes ago. Do you think higher education bubble will burst or any other industry or sector pop soon? There are so many forces in place. When we say burst, that's a good question. We do have a high amount of student loans and student loan debt, and that stuff is there. We're not at quite a bursting level yet. But the problem is colleges, like healthcare, hasn't really figured out a way to become more affordable for individuals. And we do have a system that in turn becomes very challenging to address. I'm giving a talk actually on Tuesday to another group of associate deans from business schools all over the country about how to manage college finances. We started with a $1 million deficit. We got a solid $9 million like reserve at UNM right now. And so we're really trying to make that it is possible for colleges to manage their money better without doing terrible things to their students. So Tammy says, so post-pandemic, are we demanding less entertainment and tech bells and whistles? What an interesting, I love that perspective. That's an interesting question. So when we see the turn, I think we have seen a lot of correction in particular around the entertainment side of these things. But we have seen a push for a movement into places like AI and moving into places like a lot of this hosting infrastructure and related data infrastructure and all that stuff, the cost of data, managing that data, all of that's expensive and critical. Oh, yeah. Look at that. Great. Good. Solid. Good, solid discussion on taxes. Good job, everybody. I agree with what everybody said about everything. Tech sector revenue growth, even when they're when they counteract with each other. So computing infrastructure, data processing, web hosting, and related. Revenue growth has started to re-accelerate across tech sectors in late 2023, early 2024, after slowing down. So you asked about jobs in tech. When is it going to come around? When is it going to get better? And we saw it's about deceleration and acceleration. And we've seen deceleration now for basically it's been a long, hard slog for a little while, and particularly since about 2021. Now, since that time, though, we've turned the corner. It looks like right about now, we've started to increase our revenue growth across the board, from computing infrastructure to systems design to web search portals and software publishers. Firms are forward looking. If this trajectory continues, you're going to see more hiring. That's the good news, and that's what this means. Now, on the other side, the battery manufacturing boom, just as a note, one of the coolest parts has been of the Inflation Reduction Act has been the just concentration on American manufacturing in particular. And it's been amazing to see how successful it has been at generating construction in this area. In particular, look at the jump that we've seen in battery manufacturing that's happened. Amazing. And then in real GDP growth since Q3 of 2019, California still, it is slightly higher than the national average, in fact, although it doesn't feel that way, I know for some of you, with a thought, you don't read it a lot in the, you read a lot of doom and gloom especially, but right now, GDP growth net of inflation is still up 12% in California since 2019. And that's interesting. Texas is floating at 18%. Here in New Mexico, we're dragging it down to 10. A lot of the most depressing areas, of course, upper Midwest, areas of the Northeast, lowest rates of increase. Hawaii with only 1% GDP growth, colored orange, of course, orange is the worst, I'm sorry. But yeah, really a bummer in Hawaii. really a rough hit from a different factors. Alaska too, incidentally. You know, many people associate oil with Alaska. Alaska produces about 1/4 of the oil it did back in 1987. So that's an interesting fact. So take a look at that across the board. So a lot of the western states in blue. So a solid amount of growth in the south and west. A lot of that is promising. Tennessee too. They've got a pretty robust, interesting area. Not just Nashville, but Oak Ridge, seeing some surprising growth in certain areas. Kyla asked, what does the tech job growth graph mean chronologically for jobs in the data industry, specifically data analysts? And has there been more predictive future data about when there'll be a turnaround for data-driven jobs? That's a really good question, Kyla. So let me go back here a second in the tech job growth mean. So chronologically, we have a few sectors that occurred. The biggest thing, of course, this big bump here, and thanks for asking for clarification, Kyla. 2021, we saw that surge of pandemic boom. We saw that investment, that overinvestment that happened. We had work from home technologies, data, the new normal working, that change of working environment that forced a vast amount of revenue into places that support the working from home space. And since that time, that has fallen off, and companies overhired here. They've since let go of a lot of these workers. But now we're approaching a state of what I believe to be potentially equilibrium. And right now, optimistically, I'm hoping as we approach the next year in particular, all these different tech sectors especially will have leveled off and be in areas where we're seeing some tech growth. So you asked about data analysts in particular. In particular, we're seeing this in data processing within the yellow chart, but data analysts can really be across a number of sectors. It depends on what particular company or what aspect of a company that you might serve. Data analysts can be found at any of these type of companies for sure. But in this case, we're seeing an upward trajectory that's occurred in the last year, and that revenue growth has to be sustained to encourage hiring. And I think we will see at this level, and particularly with data analysts, and because of we're in a weird space between the marshaling of AI in an effective way for data analysts that makes data analysts better at their data analyst jobs, and companies who are simultaneously saying, well, I'll just run it through AI and see what happens. We don't know what to do with this yet. And so it will depend on the company you're working for, the type of skills that you have, but I suspect revenue will continue to grow. Yeah, Aaron says California needs a major transformation of its commercial transportation logistics. Oh yeah, completely. Aaron, that's absolutely right. Tammy says, I wonder if there'll be an inevitable AI boom and bust like we saw on the internet in the late 1990s, early 2000s. It does seem that way, Tammy, right? Remember, back in the 90s, the internet was big, it's useful, it's new, it's something else, right? And we had a lot of information, but nobody knew how to use it. We didn't know the difference between the Amazon of the world and pets.com. Now, it does feel that way a bit in AI in some places, but it is now being used or allocated practically across a number of spheres. It's certainly, it's still in its amusing stage, but it's interesting to see how it will develop and ultimately what companies and firms in particular will be most successful at that. Ankur says, I know we have a pretty big healthcare sector here in Nashville. Forgot about Oracle. Oh, you're absolutely right. Huge, Ankur. Aaron says California should be an energy superpower. Absolutely. Nuclear, solar, wind, all the things. Art says work from home sucks. Yeah. Colin says I'm at work every day, Art, although I'd rather not be. Colin says by 2030, 99% of the AI companies you see today won't exist. There'll be less than 15 winners that killed off or absorbed their competitors, or perhaps existing tech companies that utilize those AI firms or bought them off and use their technologies. Anchor says, work from home saved my mental health. Also, yeah, even hybrid was rough. Same, it's too. Aaron says 99% of AI is garbage. That, God, I love reading your comments. It's so great. Aaron, Aaron's a jewel, the human being. I appreciate you, Aaron. So client use value cases, that's true. All right, good. There we go. A lot of tax policy. Awesome. Okay. Solid. There we go. Wow. You guys are great today on this comment. Cami says, can you opine on current and future immigration patterns relative to the economy? That's a great question, Cami. So right now, one thing is, according to the Economic Policy Institute, the economic growth we received last year was higher than we expected it to be. And about 50% of our economic growth was driven by higher than anticipated immigration. Now, why does immigration help the economy in general? And so through two different mechanisms, and it depends on the economic cycle that we're in. So immigration in general, and throughout all of this, and actually through research, is generally a very good thing for an economy. But Americans are mixed on this in preference. For instance, we know from a economic standpoint that highly skilled immigration and highly skilled workers are generally favorable. Most Americans are in favor of more immigration for highly skilled immigrants. People who are not in highly skilled work become increasingly anxious over immigrants around the question of jobs and pay and other things. There is research that shows that with an influx of immigrants who have a low amount of education, they often can cause some work related, not depressing wages, because that went away in a secondary study. One study showed they depressed wages for the lowest tier of workers, but another study said it had no effect. But where you see the biggest competition is in the low-skilled worker section. Immigration in the United States, if those of you have done it, is actually pretty hard sometimes. And many of you have been skilled workers, or you won the lottery, you did all these things, and you had all this ability, and as a consequence, maybe you got in easier than others, but it's been a struggle. And I've had some outstanding students from other countries who we just tried everything to get them hired at various places to no luck because of complex immigration policy. Immigrants right now, and especially as it relates to job growth, filled some of the labor shortages that we saw, especially in leisure and hospitality in the last couple of years. And that has enabled a lot of businesses that might not have thrived to continue to exist and continue to grow. And so it served a necessary purpose because we couldn't find workers in those areas. And that's a really interesting question. So immigration is uniformly a net good to an economy. But the question for immigration in particular, from a policy standpoint, is what immigration do you encourage? And then how do you make immigration, legal immigration, easier for people who are interested in immigrating to this country? And what controls need to happen here? And this is the hard part. And this is on a high horse. I mean, my family immigrated 100 years ago from Eastern Europe. They hopped on a boat, they came here, and that was it. Do you have syphilis? No, probably not. Stamp, you're in. Tuberculosis? I don't know. I don't speak English. We're going to change your name. And so as a consequence, my perception of immigration is coming here. But the broader perception of immigration in general is that, you know, some controls, of course, are needed, but how to encourage certain controls to not offset some issues in certain industries, to not, immigration does put pressure on real estate markets, but only if we're unable to build more real estate, which is most of the country. And so there's a lot of issues at stake which aren't immigration's fault that people often blame on immigration. And so we have to Art's point, you know, it's good to encourage legal immigration, but also make that process easy, transparent, and logical, none of which is with the delays we're seeing in immigration sectors. And having lost faculty now that we're trying to hire due to the immigration process, I find it debilitatingly frustrating. So, bump. Colin says, can you comment on how much legalizing prison labor has depressed wages? That's tricky. We don't have a lot of data on that. Even with the we have one of the highest rates of imprisonment or absolute number of prisoners, I think, in the world. Even with prison wages being depressed in the way that they're depressed, the location of prisons often in rural areas often make it hard to track reasonably from an economic perspective. I can look that up, but I will say that it is not a long-term effective labor market solution that I would encourage. Tammy says that I read that millennials will be likely outnumber baby boomers for the first time since 2025. What will the likely impact of this be on the economy? That's an interesting, Tammy, you got all these interesting questions. It's really interesting. So I like this as a mixture of people like who are like, I'm gonna ask a question. People are like, no, here's my opinion about stuff. And it's good. And it's like something. This is great. I love that as long as you guys are all being respectful, and I appreciate that. That's great. So baby boomers, generations past generations go, the biggest thing demographically for us as a country is we're getting older, and as a consequence, our labor market is getting smaller. So regarding immigration bolsters the labor market in a country, and that's why it does better. And so if we want to be serious about growing the economy in the next 100 years, we have to consider immigration or else change the demographics of having children. But having children is absurdly expensive, as all of you may know, and I'm a father myself. And as a consequence, there's unlikely going to be this mass turnaround where suddenly people are deciding to have, 5 kids instead of 1 or no kids. And so immigration helps bolster labor markets in depressed economies. And I think that's an important thing to consider as we enter into this debate. AI, Captain. I was trying to think of puns for this. It got worse. Data centers and power consumption. So data analysts out there and data centers are different things, but data is the name of the game in this economy. AI needs data, and managing that data is key. 15% of the power consumption of North Dakota goes to data centers. And basically 10% for all the states in red, 9 to 12 for Oregon, Wyoming, Nebraska, and Iowa. 26% for Virginia. Just rocking and rolling. Pentagon, just on fire. And then California, of course, power consumption between 3 and 6% there. Amazing, isn't it? A quarter of all power consumed in Virginia goes to data centers. Dun, dun, dun. Consumers, how are you feeling it? The economy, is it good or is it not good? Are you under stress? Credit card debt hit a fresh high, $1.14 trillion. Down the list here, auto loans skyrocketed to $1.63 trillion. And right now, our delinquent auto loans are about up to almost 3%, which again is the highest we've seen since the Great Recession. If we go back, we have to go back to about 2010 to get numbers of that level. An issue as well. Kyla says, could the data AI map also be an indication of where data jobs may have more or less growth? That's interesting because data centers are tricky. So Kyle and Anchor, that's a really good question. So when you think of a data center, we just built one here in New Mexico, our single data center. We're a small state, so we have a hand crank. We run it this way. It's data. It's 4 hard drives. We tie it together with duct tape. We're doing the best we can out here in New Mexico. But this thing is, we have this data center that we built. It's one of the ones that we had. And the jobs it created, this was actually a debate, and people were talking about this. What kind of jobs are created here? And data, the data warehousing aspect of this, we actually don't employ a lot of data analysts around the physical data. But we're looking at places where which we store data. And so we got a lot of other workers who deal with service, a warehouse of machines that are holding a lot of this data. And so not necessarily is what I would say. And so data analysts can exist anywhere, but it is interesting to see because a lot of these places, especially if you're Wyoming, Nebraska, Iowa, and North Dakota, you're bringing land to the table. If you're Virginia, you're bringing the DC area to the table and everything our US, military industrial complex infrastructure needs. And Oregon, Oregon's just Oregon, what happens out there in Oregon? No one knows. I thought Arizona might be redder too, actually. Wow, that's right. Obviously, power is a big deal. 3 Mile Island's a big deal. So auto loans are also, people are feeling the pain, even though consumer spending went up. And consumer spending is driven by the wealthiest folks, especially people in the bottom half of the distribution. You have more credit card debt than before, and you've also got a greater risk of auto loan debt. Now, a lot of people are looking at companies right now, and this is interesting. So I'll shift a little bit into finance. So one of the things that's dominated over the last pandemic years has been the success of 7 companies, the magnificent 7 firms, most headquartered in the Bay Area versus literally everybody else. And if we look at the amount of money these companies are earning, the increase in that rate of earning over the last year, 18% of S&P 500, 18% of Magnificent Seven firms reported an average growth of 18%, whereas all the other 493 companies in the S&P 500 reported an average growth of just 0.1%. Amazing. And also, if we look at this, people say, should I buy when the market's high? Well, and this is another thing based on another one of these questions. Historical data going back from about 1988 to 2023. If you invest money on any day versus investing at a new high, if you invest at a new high, your returns are actually counterintuitively higher over the long run. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that just an absolute delight? And so when we look at earnings as being a good metric or a estimation of where companies are going to go and how much money they're going to make, we have a forecast that says one of the questions we have is why do we have such concentrated performance in a few companies? And could this be sustainable? And in most cases, it's often not sustainable. And these companies, which, let's see if we can do this, Apple, Alphabet, Amazon, NVIDIA, Meta, Microsoft, Tesla, right? What are the numbers here? Is that right? I think it is-ish. Tesla's included, yeah. Yeah, that's good. Albert put it down. Albert put some down too. Yeah, it's about, those are. Do you have yeah, you got Google. Yeah, that's right. Meta is the other one that people throw in there sometimes. So that's good. That was the difference. But yeah, so you actually do pretty well on this. Where are we back on this so far? Let me get back to the questions. What's the big deal? Oh, yeah. Oh, Jochen. There we go. Jochen Wolters. Is there an actual correlation between the rise of AI and the increase in overall data center usage? Yes. Especially with a rather vague term such as data center, there might be confounding variables that aren't immediately obvious. So that's right, Dr. Wolters. So, Dr. Wolters. Mr. Wolters. Sir Wolters. One of the questions that I have, that's a really good question on this too. And I want to reiterate this, that it doesn't mean always AI. AI has increased demand and encouraged demand, but data has been a commodity for years. And our production of data, our production of storage on data, our creation of data has been dictating that growth now for decades, really. And so this is a manifestation really of the last couple decades of growth, of which AI is only the most recent manifestation. So that's absolutely right. Oh man, look at this one. This is good. All right. Aaron says, what's the big deal about 3 Mile Island? More people died from car accidents in Pennsylvania that day than ever were exposed to any nuclear waste. I'm actually in favor. Nuclear is generally a very safe and also very clean energy source. You just have this small but non-zero chance of a catastrophic event happening, but we're getting better at that. Tammy says, has car ownership decreased due to public transportation, gas prices, remote work, and Uber? Not as far as I'm aware statistically, Tammy. That's a really interesting question. I don't study that detail particularly, but even because of that, we're not seeing a necessary decline, at least in the United States, of those things. That is a good question, though. Car insurance itself has become interesting. Car data and car loans. So what's happened, okay, Tammy, there's something that we can talk about on this. That is, car loans in particular have been interesting to see. And actually, let me go back a second. I bet you I can get you some sales data from Fred on that real quick. And so I don't have ownership data because people can buy a car and let it, be in their yard for a while. But sales numbers have leveled off considerably. And if we look at total vehicle sales, let me do some little street finance here and get you a copy here. I'm working on a small monitor, so this will take a second. So I'm just gonna copy this Fred chart, put this sucker in here and do this. There we go. There's car sales over time, vehicle sales, nice and level, basically since the 70s. Despite our population, if you look at ownership rates or manifestations of these things, we used to buy cars a lot more often than we do now, relatively speaking, for our population. But right now, car sales have leveled off basically to a level that we saw back about 2011, 2012, 2013. Whether that's public transportation, gas, or insurance driven, more likely it's automotive loans and inventories and the increase in prices we saw in cars, changing the way people are behaving with regard to cars. Albert says, we'll eventually see AI the same way Dyatlov saw the 3.6 Roentgen reading to oh, that's right. Oh, God, that's great. You guys are great. I love this audience. These are my kind of nerds. Aaron says, I'm 100% nuclear, the first nuclear-powered air. That's excellent. We need 15 plants and 5 to 15 reactors, which will handle 5 million households each. Zero carbon. Yeah, it's good. Plus ugly entrants like the Tesla Cybertruck. Hey, I keep looking at the Cybertruck. The 5-year-old inside of me wants to buy it, but do I buy it? I do not. So rents for a second. Let's back up. So let's talk about rents for a second. The good news is we had a surge of multifamily housing growth post-pandemic, and that's eased the rent increases back to sort of our long-term averages. Low-end rental prices were actually down 0.2%, which is nice to hear. Now, let me go back to the slideshow for the people in the cheap seats, too. Now, a lot of you said, what about the US dollar? Is it the end of the world? Well, here's the thing. A lot of people have issue with the dollar. We don't do a lot of things well. We don't always manage the economy to the best of our ability, but we're doing better than a lot of other places. And so since 2020, since the pandemic, the international reserve market, which is already dominated by dollars in general, has seen it become more dominated by dollars because of de-Euroization. So people concerned about the long-term prospects of the euro, looking at this as a secondary issue, we've seen the euro decline. And the Chinese renminbi, the yuan is up a bit, but it's not considered yet to the level of a reserve currency like the US dollar is. And so as a consequence, when stuff happens and people pay for things, they do so more often than not using the US dollar, which is amazing. One of the last vestiges of the Bretton Woods system that really, really has helped our economy do the things we have in the last 70, 80 years now, actually, since 1944. Albert says, why were we spending so much on cars right after 9/11? Stress purchases. I don't know. That's a really good question. I'll have to look into that. I don't remember. I bought a car. God, what was I driving in 2001? A 1983 Jeep CJ7 that I bought from a guy for like $300, and it was rusted through. And the frame, held up by a hockey puck. And then I was out one day on driving that thing around, and it split in half. So it was a rough year for me. 9/11. When Albert says, let's see. So the effect of BRICS will hurt Europeans more than Americans. Yes, that's right. I think so. At this point, that's exactly what we're seeing. Tammy says, I wish more developers would convert empty malls into apartments like they've done in Minneapolis. I agree with you. I think developers have to get creative on this, and I think we got to make it easy for developers to do this. Again, converting to housing, condos, things, people control most people. 2/3 of Americans own a home. The biggest segment of wealth people generate is the equity they have in their primary residence. And it's so important that we make that possible for people to have by making it cheap. And by doing that, you got to build stuff. So speaking of which, if you're out there in the Bay Area right now buying a home, good luck. You might think it is the worst market for price to income ratios in large US cities, but you're wrong. The worst market in the country is actually Los Angeles. Yay. The price to income ratio is 12.5, meaning the median household income in LA is $76,000. The median home price is slightly less than $1 million. Together, that equals a terrible combo to purchase a house. In San Jose, it's 10.5, but in San Francisco, a comparatively cheap 9.0. Put it in the county perspective for a second here. So this is the thing too. And, I'm going to sympathize a bit. I don't live in San Mateo County. I don't live in East Bay. I don't live in, even the wonders that in LA. But I do live in a slightly orange county. So I live in this very narrow orange county in New Mexico that's kind of just hanging there at the 6 to 8 level. So this is where the expensive real estate is relative to income. And we've got this big swath here of the plains where you can buy some cheap housing. People can still, buy homes. So if you're looking for those tech jobs out in, Dodge City and perhaps suburbs of Amarillo, they're out there. Exactly. I-25 corridor in Colorado, 100%. It's ridiculous. It's flying out there. Colorado Springs to Denver in particular, massive growth and massive amounts of money there. It's amazing. Albert, San Luis Obispo made the list. Absolutely. Not tech jobs either, just people living there. It is pretty. It is pretty. One of the other places I was almost hired to teach at in my youth. There was a but you see this in the sense that it's a highly variable thing. And in the Bay Area in particular, having, let's see. Oh, we got a Q&A there. Oh, thank you for putting that question in the Q&A. Thank you. All right. Kyla says, can this also be a useful map for tenants that are just looking to rent as well? Oh, that's an interesting question. So I would say, Kyla, that's a good question. So a couple, one is if you're a tenant looking to rent, now this will look at housing, not rents. And so that may often vary in different places. There's another map that I can dig up for you, which is it the map of, is it cheaper to buy or cheaper to rent map? And in that case, you'll actually find circumstances in different places where it's better to buy or rent. Incidentally, this swath of land in the middle is often easier to buy, the coast cheaper to rent. And so it's kind of like an opposite effect. And often we reach some kind of equilibrium, but there isn't a lot of incentive for a developer to, say, build a whole bunch of apartments in places like Dodge City or rural Kansas. And so it's often cheaper just to purchase the homes there. Chicago is, Cook County is relatively cheap. That's true. Kevin's dad from Home Alone. It is it's less expensive. Even downtown, the sort of downtown real estate. I've always been, Chicago, looking at urban living, it's got a lot of great cultural attractions, and it is cheaper than New York, and it's interesting. Interesting area. So if you're looking for that, it's a very interesting idea. Let's bring it back to San Francisco for a second. Why is it so expensive in the Bay Area? This example, zoning exists, you know the story. And this is, I like this chart that Alex retweeted on this. But this is the kind of the zoning situation in San Francisco. Where can you build apartments? Where can't you build apartments? And you can see in vast areas of the city. And, I was thinking back, I always look back, my grandmother grew up here in Outer Richmond, and her dad grew up in, more of this downtown area because it was back in the old days. But Outer Richmond, of course, it's just, single family homes all the way down the line. And that's all you can build in that area. And even if you're a row house or something else, you're just not, it's fascinating to see that you just can't build more than this. And so you can't really build apartments effectively in about 3/4 of San Francisco. Interesting. So let's see this. So, this is interesting questions here. So here we go. John says, are you concerned about the price of food due to the eastward march of desertification? E.g., the 100th longitude is now the 98th longitude. That's an interesting question, the effects of this. So it's very complex, John, and I'm going to tell you. So one of my goals in life, one of my nerd hobbies is to visit every county in the United States. And I'm about 2,000 of the 3,000 counties there. And I was on a county road trip, John, right about at the 100th parallel in western Nebraska in the Sandhills. And that's interesting. Desertification is a mixed bag, and it's fascinating. I'm worried about the sustainability of the Ogallala aquifer. Absolutely. And I think our water use and our water use policies, especially around agriculture, have to change. So I think more than the actual desertification itself, I think we have to be more efficient about water use and to that extent, desertification. But what's interesting, and this is like an aside fact, I'm not disagreeing with you, and I'm not doing anything else, but I found it interesting that the sandhills of Nebraska have become more stable in the last 130 years due to ranching. And so if I have any agricultural scientists in this, I'm interested why. Because, you go to the sandhills, there are all these dunes. It's, this massive area, this big county is Cherry County in Nebraska, I believe. And this northern Nebraska county, and it's basically sandhills everywhere you go. So it looks like dunes that are covered with grass, right? And so as recently as 1,000 years ago, this was open dunes, and it was an active dune field. And since then, grass grew over it, and cattle have been grazing over it over the last, since the 1870s. And since that time, you've got this, greater stabilization, the increased nutrients, presumably from the various, cow scheisse, has created a situation that has improve the growth quality of particular grasses. But that said, it doesn't solve the water problem, which is fundamental. And while there's a price of water anywhere and infrastructure to bring water to certain places, that'll manifest itself in higher costs for consumers down the line should we not address those agricultural issues? That's a good question. So Albert says, do you stop in every county or do you drive through it? Here's the deal, Albert. I'm a busy man. I've got things to do. I got to break through and I only got one lifetime to live. I'm counting counties I drive through, but I often stop in most of them. And I've been to every state and I'm doing it. We're just making this thing happen. We're flying. That's cool. But anyway, so I got a little bit, it's a great way to see the country and understand the country and then give economics presentations about the country. So great aquifer nerds, says Aaron. Oh yeah, look at that. Aquifer nerds too. So we had a couple questions about the presidential election, and I would not be a Riley if I was not given some direction by Albert on kind of the presidential election. So I'm going to step aside on this. And predictive markets, it really is a coin flip. I don't know who's going to win the presidential election. I have no idea, no clue. I have no particular reading into this. I do know that regardless of the policies of, I mean, this is interesting. Bigger than a president is the economy. The president can affect the economy, but bigger than the president is the economy. So sometimes presidents inherit economies. They can institute policies with the help of Congress that can change the trajectory of an economy, but we're often driven highly by a lot of factors that are often outside of the presidential control. Route 66, absolutely. Art, Albuquerque, where I work, right there on Route 66. I live in Santa Fe, work in Albuquerque. So this is interesting. This is a populist viewpoint. Harris's proposals receive generally more support than Trump's, but it doesn't indicate voting preference. So if we look at the proposals, the majority of what's been proposed here, and this is again sourced from data from YouGov. Most of Harris's proposals are pretty popular. About half of Trump's proposals are pretty popular. And it's not always a good indicator of presidential outcomes. So one thing that both candidates toy with, to the annoyance of every economist, thank you, I am very mindful, very demure, and very data-driven. Very cutesy data-driven. Share of trade distorting industrial policies by motive. So the fashionable thing in the economy globally that either of the candidates are manifest, and Trump, of course, espouses this more than the average bear, is trade distorting industrial policies. What are those? Those are things like tariffs and other things. And what are trade distorting industrial policies? So some of them in advanced economies, there are climate change mitigation. That's about 29%. Some of them are resilience and food supply. So we've got a lot of stuff that that protect agriculture in particular, a lot of agricultural issues. One of the economic case studies of the 90s, looking back at NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and that interaction with Mexico, and in particular, we flooded Chiapas with American corn that should have been cheaply made in Chiapas, but we subsidized it in the United States, sold it to Chiapas, and then as a consequence, that caused regional instability in Chiapas that led to a bunch of challenging military operations there with the Mexican government. And strategic competitiveness is 21%, geopolitical concerns 13%, public health concerns 2%. In emerging market economies, most of that's based on strategic competitiveness and a whole slew of other things. And so, I expect either candidate to impose their own series of trade distorting policies, a mixture of good and bad things, which will generally, trade distortion in general is perceived correctly with suspicion by economics and finance people, even if it has good motives, because it has other effects that down the line that we don't understand and that can adversely affect the economy. But every economy is doing it, and we're doing it more often. We're doing it, and we're doing it well. So next on our on our list, wealth inequality. And so we had a question about this. It decreased slightly over the last few years, and that's been an interesting adjustment, but nobody feels it. And the perception of the economy is having a greater effect than the actual state of the economy. And inflation, while low on an annualized basis, is perceived to be high still because people don't think in yearly terms like economists. They think of the 20% increase in prices since 2020 that people feel. And so the combination of these things produces where we are now. Bringing it down to the Bay Area before I address quickly a couple other questions. San Francisco area is still seeing a decline in the overall state of the job market. Unemployment rates up to 4.7%. And also we're seeing a continued lack of growth in a number of different sectors, in particular information, shedding another 2,000 jobs in San Francisco. Down in San Jose, it's still equally gloomy in information, losing about 2,000 jobs there. The rest of the economy humming along relatively stable, but unemployment in the San Jose area about 4.5%. So let me back up a bit, and I'm going to change my screen because it's driving me nuts because I haven't, which fortunately, as you can tell, is a relatively short drive. So let me just fix a few things around here, and then I want to answer some of the questions I didn't answer. If I can just edit my screen size here. 1 second. So let's change our display resolution. There we go. I've got my screen back. Okay. Thank you so much for your patience. Now, moving on to some of Albert's questions. Thank you guys for sticking along. Wow, we still had a bunch of people here. Thought you guys all left. It got quiet after the tax thing. I really don't have a horse in that race, but I think it's a very interesting discussion. We do have to be interesting stewards in the next 50 years of our government expenditures. So tech recession end, we kind of talked about that. Interest rates. Wendy, how far do interest rates need to fall? Give me another %. That'll help things, but it's like steering a battleship. And if interest rates fall in about a percent and a half more, that signals to a lot of companies that perhaps cheaper debt is available on the move. And so that should start seeing some uptick in the economy. But the Fed is trying to balance high rates slowing the economy, and so for tech in particular, you're lost in the snow here. What is the outlook on the next decade and beyond? I'm very optimistic about climate technologies, but in the free market sense of this. So I think that one of the two ways you can get people, I think we've got a lot of stimuli out there and a lot of incentives to encourage this, but I think people are choosing this. People are choosing to put conscious technologies in their portfolio. We're still seeing robust growth in ESG metrics and other metrics that look at sustainable financing. And so I'm motivated there because even people who are naysayers or indifferent to the question of climate change in general are cognizant of the way investment moves. And any person who's a merchant by nature or in finance or economics understands that you got to go where the market is demanding, and the market's demanding climate. And so that's still happening. What else can I do besides applying for jobs? Oh, that's a question I had. What else can I do? That's a really good question. So besides applying for jobs, upskill all the way. Learn something new every day. Whatever it is, do it. Do not end with curiosity. And also, this is the thing. I was just hiring someone this week, and we had a candidate who didn't ask a question. When you ask and say, do you have any questions? And they didn't have anything. And I'm like, oh, man. Ask questions. Show us you have curiosity. Curiosity in all things. It's the most valuable skill I can imagine. Truly. But I'm a nerd, so I value those things. I'm good cop. No, I do. I'm irrelevant cop. I'm like, okay, thank you for applying for this position of service worker 3. A train left Omaha at 3:50 p.m. on November 22nd. Another train left Wichita Falls. That's what I do. That's the start of every question. John, you're right. Upskill all the way. Make it happen. Expectations for 2025 for a win by either of the two presidential candidates. I think it depends the question of the candidate versus the combination of Congress and what policies they can do. So a candidate without control of both houses will find it challenging to enact partisan legislation. And as a consequence, then the biggest drivers of the economy won't come from internal, but external or outside macroeconomic sources. We got Nobel Prize done. Warning signs of a crash. How do you spot the warning signs of a crash? Too much of one thing in an area, something we haven't seen before. For instance, too much debt in one space. Extraordinary unsustainable price growth. All the signs of a bubble. Every crash looks a little different. We don't see a lot of situations right now that imply an exact crash. Everything's more expensive. It's harder to maintain prices, but even consumer debt being dominated, by mortgages, which most people that are holding them still hold really low rates on these mortgages, aren't really in full suffering mode. And so we don't see a kind of widespread economic malaise that may happen. But again, we have to be careful about this because the economy, a lot of things can set off the economy at any time. And particularly, I think we would have certainly been in a recession last year had not the Treasury come in response to the bank failures and opened up lines of credit to banks. I think we would have been in a bank cycle induced crash, but that had not happened, and that was fortunate. One person said inflation plus mass layoffs plus competitive job market, all three of which seem strongly and artificially spurred by corporate interests, are making it difficult to survive in this economy. Any end in sight to any of that? Well, that's interesting. So inflation, we're almost at the end of the rope on this. We're up about 2.4%. That's close to the 2% target annually, but prices don't go down. And one of the greatest discrepancies between the way that we think as economics and finance people and normal people think is we're like, oh, inflation's 2%, it's under control. And normal people are like, but the prices aren't coming down. And they won't come down. And that's the really interesting part about this, is that even though prices won't come down unless it's a catastrophic concern, and that's the only situation that would happen in. Let's see here. So what's the coat of arms piece? Oh yeah, that's tough. Sorry about that. I was opening these things. I realized I didn't know my arm was showing. That's right. So it's related. It's taken from one of my paternal grandmother's coat of arms that used the arms of Scotland in it. So it was interesting there too. So my mother's family is very Eastern European. My father's family is very, my grandmother was Irish, but they were kind of old school Americans since the beginning of really true colonialism. We're colonizing things all the time. Kyla says, thank you so much for all the info you shared. I learned a lot so far. I found the graph so fascinating and insightful. Thank you so much for the kind words. Professional email contact info. Yes, please do. And reach out. Thank you. That's absolutely right. So a lot of things on this. Thank you, Albert, for sending my LinkedIn. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn anytime. Email is just my name at unm.edu. I am in like 12 hours of meetings, no joke, every day. So if I don't get back to you immediately, I will get back to you if you send me an email, but reach out on LinkedIn if you have any questions on things. I welcome it. And if you have, I don't update my LinkedIn like events enough, but I do like connecting, and it is an easy way for you to reach out to me. So I do encourage you to do it. Oh man, did I cover everything? What am I missing? I love it. You guys are so patient, so good as always. It's so good to see you in those things. I got another thing. I've got, got some Germans on my mother's side. We got that. A few Dutch, Swedes, Scandinavians, all various things. Russians, Tartars. Oh, man. What do we got? Is it Riley? At unm.edu. Oh, I like it. U and M. I love that. U and M. Who's M? I don't know, but it's us both. Yeah, that's right. I'm sorry. I'll put it in there. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Albert. Fourth generation Seattleite. I love it. Seattle's a great city.
All right, cool. We go exactly almost 90 minutes here. So
Yeah,
looking ahead, obviously we have this small deal thing in a couple of weeks, and then we're meeting up again on the 18th. So it's, less than a month from now. One thing I noticed, and I called this out when I emailed you earlier today, Dr. White, was that the October labor report launches Friday, November 1st, 4 days before the election. Are we thinking October, November surprise, or maybe just a continuation of everything we've been seeing?
So this is a great question. So I'll label it right here. The job market is going up a bit, but it is highly competitive right now and more competitive than we've seen. I think I'm not expecting a surprise, and I don't expect us to shoot this out of the water in positive news. We're seeing growth really in two sectors, and that's it. The tendency is continued tightening until it's going to get worse before it gets better still, I think.
Yeah.
That's my 2 cents. Whether it's going to be this month or next month or 5 months from now, we'll figure it out.
Okay.
Oh man, thank you so much.
Yeah,
Dr.
Joshin,
Fosa,
this is why we do this
great.
webinar, because number one, I don't have to sell anybody anything, and we don't have to upsell a boot camp. Number two, it is pretty dang entertaining. And number three, I learned so much.
Yep. We get to be nerds together.
Yeah.
You guys are the
so-
best nerds to nerd with. Everybody here. Thank you for hanging around. You really are. You're so patient. Thank you. I don't think you come too. It's such an honor to have such a great team here. This is great. You guys are
Thank you
great.
to everyone who showed up.
So, with those final thoughts, then I think it's like, I guess it's like, it's, I think about the state of the economy. I think about the job search. I think about this upcoming election. And, I've noticed that I think a lot of people over the last couple of weeks have gone from being active in their job search to wait and see mode. And, once the election happens and we get out of our collective tension, regardless of who wins, then I feel like maybe the market will loosen up and, we'll see maybe a hiring rush all the way through Thanksgiving, and then we'll break for the holidays.
Hiring rush. That's great.
I don't know. I'm hoping for
I
a
like
hiring
it.
rush.
Optimism. This is great.
Optimism. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I think tech's going to clear out before we clear out other sectors. I'm optimistic. We're going to figure this out.
yeah. And
It's Albert's
like
list,
it's interesting too, because every single January tech companies do their annual culling of the herd. But if you've already culled most of the herd, are you really going to do much more culling this coming January? I mean, I think the answer is still yes, but still. So yeah.
There's always a sickly cow. There's always
a sickly
always a
cow.
bull, I'm always there. That's why I have tenure. People tried to cull me. They can't cull me now. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, they can. It's harder.
So the lesson still remains the same, right? Upskill, network, improve your interviewing skills. All, by the way, opportunities and services available to you via Albert's List. If we're going to watch maybe 2 or 3 economic indicators between now and November 18th, what would they be? In my opinion, it's the labor report on the 1st, the Fed lowering rates on the 8th, and then I don't know, maybe a consumer sentiment report, which seems like consumer sentiment it's been at its highest in a long time. So
It's true. Sentiment has been weird because people have been, oh, I'm bummed out about the economy, then spending a lot of money anyway, which kind of throws out the whole indicator's purpose anyway, because it's supposed to be.
depressed. Yeah.
I agree though. So Aaron's got a point. If the Fed continues to cut rates, I think we'll be in a good position. If we I'm looking for one thing. I'm looking for us to turn the corner on consumer debt and auto debt and us to get to a position where those delinquency rates drop. That means consumers are better off. And if that happens,
Aaron's opinions are actually
Well,
kind of consistent with what I'm telling people, is that
they are. You're Aaron now.
you've been telling people, I mean, you're saying, right, like that we're spring loading for Q1, but then you're also saying that it'll be worse before it gets better. So in my mind, we're looking at a cold winter, and then it'll be a very warm spring.
I like that point too. And I want to add one thing real quick, and that I think that if we can show hiring growth that is above 200, really 250, but 200K for the next 2 months, I'm ready to jump on the happy bandwagon, but I'm going to wait. Give me 3 months.
I'm ready to see interest rates come down. I'm ready to see employers get off the sidelines. I'm ready to see employees get off the sidelines. And I'm looking forward to a very warm spring ahead. So
that's right.
Yeah. If you have no further thoughts, I'm going to go ahead and conclude here.
Who pays for potholes on my roads?
Oh gosh, this is a roads example. All right. Well, thank you, Art. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Joshin. Thank you, Kyla. It's good to have you all here, and we will see you on November 18th for our next webinar. If you haven't voted yet, go and vote. Vote early, but don't vote often. And watch your week. What that? Yeah,
Vote
vote early,
forever.
but don't
Yes.
vote often. And since this is going on YouTube, I'm saying that twice.
Yeah,
Yeah,
join
hundreds of
us.
ballots. That's great.
Yeah.
And join us for our next webinar on November 18th, where we're going to do much of the same, including, celebrating or lamenting, depending on who your candidate, is, and much more, and looking ahead to what those economic policies will be for the next 4 years. So happy Wednesday evening. Take care of yourselves. Be good to each other. And we will see you all very, very soon. Thanks so much, and bye.